They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I served mine at exactly 3:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day, and it was ice-cold perfection. But before I tell you how I bought my own husband's company out from under him for $30 million, let me tell you why he deserved every brutal second of what was coming to him. Hi everyone, wherever you're watching this from, whether you're curled up in bed, driving to work, or maybe even hiding in your bathroom just trying to get a moment of peace, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are. Because this story, it's going to take you on a ride that'll make you question everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the sweet, devastating taste of justice. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole heart, hit that subscribe button right now, because you're going to want to hear every single word of what happens next. My name is Rebecca Martinez Hawthorne, though back then I still believed the Hawthorne name meant something beautiful. I was 32 years old, living in what everyone called the perfect life in Westport, Connecticut. You know the kind, sprawling colonial house with a circular driveway, Range Rover in the garage, closet full of designer clothes I never really wanted. From the outside, I had everything a woman could ask for. From the inside, I was drowning in a prison made of gold. I met David Hawthorne at a charity gala in Manhattan when I was 26. Fresh out of my MBA from Wharton, working 60-hour weeks at a mid-tier consulting firm, I was ambitious, driven, hungry for something more. David was 34 then, devastatingly handsome in that old money way, perfectly styled dark hair, expensive suit that fit like it was sewn onto his body, confidence that filled every room he entered. He was already running operations at Hawthorne Industries, the family manufacturing company his grandfather had built from nothing in the 1940s. The company was David's birthright, his identity, his entire world. Hawthorne Industries manufactured specialized industrial equipment, nothing glamorous, but incredibly profitable. They had contracts with Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, international clients. The business was worth somewhere north of $40 million, though the family kept the exact numbers locked tighter than Fort Knox. David swept me off my feet with a romance that felt like something out of a movie. Private jets to Paris for weekend getaways, front row seats to Broadway shows, jewelry that cost more than my annual salary. He made me feel like I was the most important person in his universe. When he proposed 18 months later with his great-grandmother's 5-carat diamond ring, I said yes without hesitation. I thought I was marrying my best friend, my partner, the love of my life. The wedding was everything the society pages dream about. 400 guests at the Hawthorne family estate in the Hamptons, a 10-piece orchestra, flowers flown in from Holland, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a month. David's parents, Margaret and Charles Hawthorne, spared no expense making sure everyone knew their son was marrying beneath his station, but they were gracious enough to welcome me anyway. Margaret was a force of nature, 63 years old, silver hair always pulled back in a perfect chignon, pearls that probably cost more than my childhood home. She had this way of smiling at you while her eyes stayed completely cold, like she was performing kindness rather than feeling it. Charles was quieter but just as calculating, the kind of man who could destroy your reputation with a single phone call and never raise his voice doing it. From day one, they made it clear I was an outsider who'd gotten lucky. Every family dinner was a masterclass in subtle insults dressed up as concern. Rebecca, dear, are you sure that dress is the right choice for the country club? Perhaps you should let David handle the financial discussions, sweetheart. These family business matters can be so complicated. We just want to make sure our son is protected, you understand. David either didn't notice or didn't care. In public, he was the perfect husband, attentive, affectionate, proud to show me off. But behind closed doors, something started shifting within the first year of our marriage. The romantic gestures became fewer and farther between. The conversations got shorter. The physical intimacy became perfunctory, like another item to check off his daily to-do list. I tried everything I could think of to reconnect with him. I planned surprise date nights, booked couples retreats, suggested counseling. But David was always too busy with work, too stressed about some crisis at the company, too tired to put effort into us. Meanwhile, his parents' subtle campaign to make me feel unwelcome in my own marriage intensified. The worst part was how isolated I became. My old friends from before the marriage had slowly drifted away, partly because I'd been so consumed with David in those early days, partly because our lives had become so different. The Hawthorne social circle never really accepted me. I was invited to the parties and charity events, but I could feel the whispers, the sidelong glances, the way conversations would stop when I approached. I threw myself into trying to contribute to the family business. I had a Harvard MBA and 8 years of consulting experience. I knew I could add value to Hawthorne Industries. But every suggestion I made was politely dismissed. Every attempt to get involved was redirected toward more appropriate activities like planning the company Christmas party or organizing Margaret's charity luncheons. The business has been in our family for 3 generations, Rebecca, Charles explained to me one evening over dinner at their house. We have a very particular way of doing things. It's not that we don't appreciate your education. It's just that some traditions are best left unchanged. Margaret nodded along, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. Besides, dear, you have so many other talents. Your party planning skills are really quite impressive. Perhaps you should focus on the areas where you naturally excel. David said nothing. Just sat there eating his meal like his parents hadn't just told his wife she was too stupid to contribute to the business that would supposedly be part of her future. That night, lying in bed next to my husband while he scrolled through emails on his phone, I made my first real decision in years. If the Hawthorns thought I wasn't smart enough to be part of their precious company, I'd show them exactly how wrong they were. I just had no idea yet what that would look like. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since before my wedding day. If I was going to be trapped in this marriage, living under the constant judgment of people who saw me as nothing more than an expensive decoration, then I needed to build something of my own. Something they couldn't take away from me, couldn't diminish, couldn't control. I started small. I reached out to my old network from consulting, began taking on freelance projects under my maiden name. Financial analysis, market research, strategic planning, all the skills David's parents thought I didn't possess. I worked from the home office while David was at the company, telling him I was just keeping busy with some charity work. Within 6 months, I had a steady stream of clients. Within a year, I'd incorporated as Martina's Strategic Consulting. The work was challenging, fulfilling, and profitable. For the first time since my wedding, I felt like myself again. Like I had value beyond being Mrs. David Hawthorne. But the real breakthrough came when one of my clients, a private equity firm in Manhattan, offered me something I'd never expected, the chance to learn their business from the inside out. They were impressed with my work and wanted to bring me on as a partner track consultant, specializing in manufacturing acquisitions. Manufacturing acquisitions. Companies exactly like Hawthorne Industries. I spent the next 2 years learning everything I could about private equity, leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, and the art of acquiring family businesses whose owners had grown complacent. I studied the industry inside and out, built relationships with investors, created financial models that could strip a company down to its core value and rebuild it into something more profitable. And all the while, I watched David and his parents continue to treat me like an expensive pet they'd grown tired of but couldn't get rid of. If you're still with me, and you're feeling that familiar burn of being underestimated by people who should love you, go ahead and hit that like button. Because what I'm about to tell you next is where this story really begins. It's where I stopped being the victim and started becoming something much more dangerous. Margaret Hawthorne had no idea that the daughter-in-law she'd spent 4 years trying to diminish was about to buy her family's company right out from under them. But that's exactly what I was planning to do. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took almost 2 years of careful planning, strategic thinking, and building relationships that would serve me when the time came. But the moment I truly understood what I was capable of came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, exactly 13 months before that Thanksgiving dinner. I was sitting in the offices of Meridian Capital, the private equity firm that had become my second home, reviewing acquisition targets with my mentor, James Chen. James was everything Charles Hawthorne wasn't: brilliant, self-made, and completely uninterested in whose bloodline you came from. He cared about results, and I'd been delivering them consistently for 18 months. "Rebecca, take a look at this," James said, sliding a folder across his mahogany desk. family-owned manufacturing company in Connecticut. Third-generation business, solid client base, but the management is getting complacent. Revenue's flat, they're not investing in modernization, and there are rumors of some internal family conflicts affecting operations. I opened the folder and my heart stopped. It was a preliminary assessment of Hawthorne Industries. Someone had commissioned a detailed analysis of my husband's company, financial projections, market position, potential acquisition value. The numbers were all there, laid out in black and white like a roadmap to everything I'd never been allowed to see. The owner's son is currently running operations, I read aloud, trying to keep my voice steady. David Hawthorne. MBA from Dartmouth, but limited experience outside the family business. The company has significant untapped potential but appears resistant to outside investment or strategic partnerships. James leaned back in his chair, studying my reaction. Do you know anything about this company? I thought you mentioned you lived in Westport. I made a split-second decision that would change everything. I know of them. They have a solid reputation in the industry, but you're right about the management being set in their ways. Very insular, very traditional. The kind of company that could be incredibly profitable with the right leadership but is probably leaving millions on the table. It wasn't technically a lie. Everything I'd said was true. I just hadn't mentioned that I was married to the man whose business acumen I'd just questioned to one of Manhattan's most successful private equity partners. The preliminary numbers suggest an acquisition cost of around 28 to 32 million, James continued. For a company with that revenue base, it could be a goldmine if we can modernize their operations and expand their market reach. But they'd never sell to us directly. The family has turned down approaches before. That's when the idea first started forming in my mind. Not fully developed yet, but a tiny seed of possibility that made my pulse quicken. What if they didn't know they were selling to you? I asked carefully. What if the approach came from someone they trusted, someone who understood their industry, someone who could present the acquisition as a family-friendly transition rather than a corporate takeover? James raised an eyebrow. You're thinking about a shell company approach. Interesting. We'd need someone with deep industry knowledge, someone who could gain their confidence, someone who could get access to their internal financials and operations. Someone exactly like their daughter-in-law who'd been studying manufacturing acquisitions for 2 years and had unlimited access to their family dinners, their business conversations, their private moments of vulnerability. It's just a thought, I said, closing the folder. But if you're serious about pursuing this target, I'd love to be involved in the strategy development. That night, I lay awake next to David, listening to him breathe, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 4 years of being dismissed, diminished, treated like an expensive accessory that had lost its novelty. 4 years of watching him prioritize everything and everyone above our marriage. 4 years of his parents making it clear that I would never be good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to be a real part of their family. But now I had something they didn't know about. I had knowledge, connections, and a plan that was starting to crystallize in my mind like ice forming on a winter window. Over the next several weeks, I began what I now think of as my intelligence-gathering phase. I started paying closer attention during family dinners, asking innocent questions about the business that David and his parents were happy to answer because they thought I was just making polite conversation. How's the Patterson contract going? I'd ask over Sunday roast. Oh, that's been our biggest client for 15 years, Charles would reply proudly. 20% of our annual revenue. They're practically family at this point. Or, David, you mentioned some issues with the Chicago facility last week. How did that turn out? Just some equipment maintenance problems, David would say dismissively. Nothing we haven't handled before. Though the repair costs were higher than we budgeted. These old machines require more upkeep every year. Every casual question, every offhand comment, every piece of financial information they shared was another puzzle piece in the bigger picture I was building. And because they saw me as harmless, just a wife trying to show interest in her husband's work, they never thought to guard their words around me. I learned that their biggest client contract was up for renewal in 18 months. I learned that their Chicago facility needed significant infrastructure investment they kept postponing. I learned that David was considering expanding into overseas markets, but his parents were resistant to the risk. I learned that Margaret was pushing Charles to think about succession planning, but David wasn't ready for full control and they didn't trust him with it yet. Most importantly, I learned that they were all completely confident in their position. They thought Hawthorne Industries was untouchable, that their family legacy was secure, that nothing could threaten the empire Charles's father had built. Meanwhile, I was spending my days learning exactly how to dismantle everything they'd built. James introduced me to Marcus Rodriguez, a former investment banker who specialized in creating acquisition vehicles for sensitive deals. Marcus was the one who suggested setting up Distinct Holdings as a Delaware corporation, a completely separate entity that would give us the legal structure we needed to move forward. The beauty of this approach, Marcus explained during one of our strategy sessions, is that the target company never sees you coming. They think they're negotiating with a legitimate buyer who shares their values, who understands their industry, who wants to preserve their legacy. By the time they realize what's really happening, it's too late to back out. I spent hours crafting Distinct Holdings' corporate identity. On paper, we were a family-owned investment firm specializing in manufacturing acquisitions, with a particular focus on preserving the legacy and values of multi-generational businesses. We had a website, a corporate office address, even business cards with my name listed as Rebecca Martinez, managing partner. The irony was delicious. I was using my maiden name, the name Margaret Hawthorne had always made me feel ashamed of, to create the company that would eventually own everything the Hawthorne name represented. But the most challenging part wasn't the corporate structure or the financial planning. It was learning to live with the secret. Every family dinner became a performance. Every conversation with David became a careful dance around topics that might reveal what I was planning. Every kiss goodnight was delivered by someone his family would never recognize. David started noticing that I seemed different, more confident, more engaged with life. He attributed it to some new hobby or friend group, never suspecting that his wife was spending 40 hours a week learning how to acquire companies exactly like his. "You seem happy lately," he said one evening as we got ready for bed. "More like your old self." "I've just been keeping busy," I replied, which was technically true. "Taking on some consulting projects, learning new things. It feels good to be challenged again." He smiled and kissed my forehead. "I'm glad. You were getting a little, I don't know, restless for a while there. I was worried you were getting bored with our life." Bored. Not hurt, not lonely, not diminished by years of being treated like a beautiful burden. Just bored. That's when I knew for certain that I was making the right choice. David genuinely had no idea what he'd done to our marriage, how his family's treatment had affected me, or how little he actually knew about the woman he'd married. He thought I was a simple person with simple needs, and that a few kind words and expensive gifts were enough to keep me content. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. By the spring of that year, Distinct Holdings had raised $32 million from investors, with me contributing $2 million of my own money from my consulting business. We were ready to make an approach to Hawthorne Industries. The only question was timing. I wanted to wait until the perfect moment, a moment when the family would be most receptive to a sale, when their guard would be down, when they'd be thinking about legacy and tradition rather than suspecting betrayal. I wanted to wait until Thanksgiving. The months leading up to Thanksgiving were a masterclass in patience and precision. I had to become someone I'd never been before, calculating, secretive, ruthlessly focused on an outcome that would destroy the people I'd once loved. Some nights I lay awake wondering if I was becoming a person I could live with. Other nights, I remembered Margaret's cold smile as she told me I wasn't smart enough to understand their family business, and the doubt disappeared completely. By September, I had assembled what I privately called my war council. James Chen from Meridian Capital was my strategic advisor, helping me navigate the complexities of hostile acquisitions disguised as friendly overtures. Marcus Rodriguez had created an airtight corporate structure that would protect me legally and financially. And I brought in Sarah Kim, a forensic accountant who specialized in family business valuations. Sarah was brilliant, ruthless, and had no patience for the kind of old money arrogance the Hawthornes represented. She'd grown up poor in Queens, worked her way through Columbia on scholarships, and built her reputation by exposing the financial weaknesses of companies whose owners thought their family names made them untouchable. Family businesses like this always have the same vulnerabilities, Sarah explained during one of our planning sessions in October. They're emotionally attached to assets that aren't performing, they resist modernization because it feels like betraying their ancestors, and they make financial decisions based on tradition rather than data. She was right. Over the past 6 months, I'd watched the Hawthorns make decision after decision that prioritized sentiment over strategy. They kept the Chicago facility running despite its deteriorating profitability because Charles' father had opened it in 1962. They maintained relationships with suppliers who'd been overcharging them for years because those relationships went back decades. They refused to explore automation because they believed craftsmanship couldn't be replicated by machines. Every sentimental choice was a financial weakness I could exploit. The key, Marcus added, is making them believe they're in control of the sale. They need to think this is their idea, their timeline, their decision. The moment they feel pressured or manipulated, they'll shut down negotiations and probably never trust anyone again. That's where my inside knowledge became invaluable. I knew Charles's greatest fear was that David wasn't ready to take over the company. I knew Margaret worried about their legacy being forgotten after they were gone. I knew David felt the weight of 3 generations of expectations and secretly wondered if he was capable of living up to them. Most importantly, I knew that Thanksgiving dinner was sacred to the Hawthorne family. It was when Charles traditionally made his most important announcements, when family decisions were shared and celebrated, when the patriarchal structure of their world was most firmly established. If I could get them to make the sale decision by Thanksgiving, they'd want to announce it as a family triumph. Charles would present it as his wisdom, Margaret would frame it as protecting their legacy, and David would see it as his path to finally proving himself worthy of his inheritance. The first approach came in early October, delivered through a chain of intermediaries that led back to distinct holdings without revealing my involvement. A polite letter expressing interest in manufacturing acquisitions, specifically targeting family-owned businesses with strong reputations and growth potential. I watched David open the letter at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, his forehead creasing as he read. "Someone wants to buy the company," he said, sliding the letter across the table to me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I kept my voice perfectly casual. "Really? What do they say?" "It's from some company called Distinct Holdings. They specialize in family business acquisitions, apparently. They're interested in discussing a potential purchase that would honor our legacy while providing opportunities for strategic growth." David made air quotes around the corporate speak, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. "That's interesting," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Are you considering it?" "I don't know. Dad's always said the company would never be sold outside the family. But—" He trailed off, staring at the letter. "But what?" "But maybe it's worth hearing what they have to say. I mean, if something happened to Dad, if I'm not ready to take over completely, maybe having the right partner could be a good thing." It was exactly the response I'd been hoping for. David was already starting to rationalize the sale as a safety net rather than an admission of failure. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later, this time with more specific language about preserving family legacies and maintaining existing management structures. I'd crafted every word to appeal to their deepest insecurities while making the acquisition sound like an honor rather than a business transaction. Charles called a family meeting for the following Sunday. I sat in their formal living room, surrounded by portraits of dead Hawthorns and furniture that cost more than most people's cars, listening to my father-in-law debate the merits of selling the company I was secretly buying. "The approach seems legitimate," Charles said, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the letters. "They're specifically interested in manufacturing companies with our profile. Family-owned, established client base, room for growth." "But why would we sell?" Margaret asked. "The company is profitable. David is perfectly capable of taking over when you're ready to step down." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Actually, Mom, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Maybe having a partner wouldn't be the worst thing. Someone with fresh capital, new ideas, connections we don't have." I watched the family dynamics play out exactly as I'd predicted. Charles was intrigued by the financial opportunity. Margaret was concerned about preserving their reputation. David was seeing the sale as a solution to his own insecurities about leadership. What do we know about this distinct holdings company? I asked, playing the role of the concerned wife. If you're going to consider selling, shouldn't we make sure they are legitimate? Charles nodded approvingly. Rebecca raises a good point. I'll have our attorney do some research on their background. Over the next month, Charles's research turned up exactly what I wanted him to find. Distinct Holdings had a clean corporate structure, impressive financial backing, and a stated mission of preserving family business legacies. The managing partner, Rebecca Martinez, had an impeccable educational background and a track record of successful manufacturing acquisitions. What Charles didn't know was that Rebecca Martinez and Rebecca Hawthorne were the same person, and that every successful acquisition in her track record had been carefully crafted to create exactly this impression. The third letter arrived in early November, with an offer to meet in person to discuss the family's goals and concerns. By then, Charles had convinced himself that selling to the right buyer might actually be the best way to protect everything his father had built. "They want to meet," he announced at Sunday dinner. "The managing partner is willing to come here, to our offices, to see the business firsthand and discuss terms." "What kind of terms?" David asked. Charles smiled, the expression of a man who thought he was in complete control of his own destiny. "They're suggesting a purchase price in the range of $30 million. For a company, we could never get that kind of valuation from a traditional buyer." $30 million. I'd lowballed them by $2 million to make the offer more attractive, knowing they'd negotiate up from there. The psychology was perfect, high enough to make them feel valued, but not so high that they'd be suspicious. "When do they want to meet?" Margaret asked. "They are flexible on timing. I was thinking we could schedule something for the week after Thanksgiving, once the holidays are over." I saw my opening. "Actually," I said carefully, "wouldn't it be interesting to have them join us for Thanksgiving dinner? If they're really committed to preserving family businesses, what better way to understand our family than to experience one of our most important traditions?" The suggestion was audacious, but I'd calculated the psychology perfectly. The Hawthorns loved showing off their wealth, their traditions, their superiority to outsiders. The idea of having a potential buyer witness their family harmony and success would be irresistible. Charles's eyes lit up. "That's actually a brilliant idea, Rebecca. It would give us a chance to evaluate them in an informal setting, and it would certainly demonstrate our family values." David squeezed my hand under the table. "I love it. It's like a test for both sides." Margaret was nodding slowly. We could see how they handle themselves in our environment, whether they really understand what makes our family special. And just like that, I had maneuvered my husband's family into inviting me to their Thanksgiving dinner as the secret buyer of their company. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched them prepare for what they thought would be their moment of triumph. Margaret planned the menu with military precision. Charles rehearsed his talking points about family legacy and business philosophy. David practiced presenting the company's strengths and growth potential. None of them suspected that their dinner guest would be the woman they'd spent 4 years underestimating, the daughter-in-law they dismissed as intellectually inferior, the wife who'd been planning their downfall for over a year. The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke up next to David and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: perfect, crystalline clarity about who I was and what I was about to do. Today, the Hawthorne family would learn exactly what Rebecca Martinez was capable of. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and clear in Westport, the kind of crisp November day that makes every bare tree branch look like it was sketched against the sky with a sharp pencil. I stood at our bedroom window, watching David's breath fog the glass as he spoke into his phone, confirming last-minute details with his parents about our mysterious dinner guest. He had no idea that the woman he was married to was the same woman who would be sitting at their dining room table in 6 hours, ready to turn their world upside down. I'd barely slept the night before, running through every possible scenario, every contingency plan, every emotional reaction I might need to navigate. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about justice, vindication, and finally showing the Hawthorne family exactly who they'd been dismissing for 4 years. "Rebecca Martinez should be arriving around 3, David said, hanging up the phone and turning back to me. Dad's really excited about this meeting. He thinks she could be the perfect partner to take the company to the next level. That's wonderful, I replied, adjusting the collar of the burgundy silk blouse I'd chosen specifically because Margaret had once commented that jewel tones were perhaps a bit bold for my complexion. Today, I wanted to be bold. Today, I wanted to be unforgettable. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. David was excited to meet the woman who was going to buy his family's company, completely unaware that he'd been living with her for 4 years. His parents had spent weeks researching my background, analyzing my credentials, preparing to evaluate whether I was worthy of their trust, never realizing they'd been evaluating their own daughter-in-law's business acumen. I'd created Rebecca Martinez to be everything Rebecca Hawthorne wasn't allowed to be. Confident, successful, independent, respected. She was the woman I'd been before I got lost in the golden cage of this marriage, and she was the woman I was going to be again after today. We arrived at the Hawthorne estate at 2:30, giving me time to help Margaret with final preparations while Charles and David set up the formal dining room for what they thought would be their moment of triumph. The house was magnificent as always, 12,000 square feet of old-money elegance, with Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars and artwork that belonged in museums. Margaret was in her element, directing the catering staff with the precision of a military general while wearing a cream-colored cashmere ensemble that probably cost more than I'd made in my first year out of college. She'd had her hair and makeup professionally done, and every piece of jewelry she wore was a family heirloom worth a fortune. "Rebecca, dear, would you mind arranging the flowers in the front parlor?" she asked, not really asking. "I want everything to be perfect when Ms. Martinez arrives. First impressions are so important." "Of course," I said, taking the crystal vases full of white orchids and roses. "I want today to be perfect too." If only she knew how perfect it was going to be. Charles was in his study, reviewing notes he'd prepared about the company's history, its values, its commitment to quality and tradition. I could hear him practicing his speech through the closed door, the same speech he'd given to potential business partners, investors, and clients for 30 years. He genuinely believed that his family's story was so compelling, so inspiring, that anyone would be honored to become part of their legacy. David was nervous in a way I hadn't seen since our wedding day. He kept adjusting his tie, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror, asking me if I thought he looked professional enough to make a good impression on our guest. "You look perfect," I assured him, straightening his collar with hands that weren't quite steady. "Ms. Martinez is going to be very impressed with you." More impressed than you can possibly imagine, I thought. At exactly 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Charles answered it personally, greeting the woman he thought was a stranger with the kind of warm authority he perfected over decades of business dinners and charity galas. "Ms. Martinez, welcome to our home. I'm Charles Hawthorne." I listened from the kitchen, hearing my own voice respond with professional courtesy and just the right amount of gratitude for the invitation. Rebecca Martinez was confident but not arrogant, interested but not desperate, sophisticated but approachable. She was everything I'd designed her to be. "Please, call me Rebecca," I heard myself say. "Thank you so much for including me in your family celebration. I know how important Thanksgiving traditions are." Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, smoothing her skirt and checking her lipstick one final time. "How do I look, dear?" "Absolutely perfect," I said, which was true. Margaret always looked perfect. It was one of her most frightening qualities. She swept into the foyer to greet our guest, and I followed a few steps behind, playing the role of the supportive daughter-in-law welcoming a stranger into the family home. The moment I walked into that foyer and made eye contact with Charles, Margaret, and David while they looked right through me and saw only Rebecca Martinez, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I'd ever experienced. They were seeing exactly who I really was, successful, confident, worthy of their respect, but they couldn't recognize me because they'd never actually looked at me before. "And this is my daughter-in-law, Rebecca Hawthorne," Margaret said, gesturing toward me with the kind of casual dismissal I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "What a coincidence," Rebecca Martinez said with a perfectly calculated smile. "We share the same first name." "How lovely," Margaret replied without really listening, already turning her attention back to the guest she actually cared about impressing. David shook hands with the woman he didn't know was his wife, commenting on how remarkable it was that someone so young had achieved so much in the business world. Charles launched into his prepared remarks about family values and legacy preservation. Margaret offered a tour of the house, pointing out antiques and artwork that demonstrated their impeccable taste and substantial wealth. I followed along, playing my assigned role as the decorative wife while simultaneously being treated as an honored guest whose opinions and expertise were valued and respected. The psychological whiplash was intense, but also oddly liberating. For the first time in years, I was seeing myself through the eyes of people who didn't know they were supposed to diminish me. Charles led us into his study, where the walls were lined with photographs of 3 generations of Hawthorne men standing in front of factory buildings, shaking hands with important clients, accepting industry awards. It was a shrine to masculine achievement and patriarchal succession, with no images of women except for formal family portraits where wives and daughters appeared as beautiful accessories to the men's accomplishments. "This is the legacy we're hoping to preserve," Charles explained, gesturing to a photograph of his father standing next to the original Hawthorne Industries building in 1947. 3 generations of commitment to quality, integrity, and family values. Rebecca Martinez nodded thoughtfully, asking exactly the right questions about company history, market position, and growth potential. She demonstrated deep knowledge of the manufacturing industry while showing appropriate respect for the family's achievements. She was the perfect buyer, someone who understood both the business and emotional significance of what they were offering to sell. What Charles, Margaret, and David couldn't see was that she was also the perfect revenge. As we moved from the study to the formal living room, Margaret began her subtle interrogation of our guest's background, family connections, and social standing. It was the same process she'd put me through when David and I were first engaged, except this time she was trying to determine whether someone was worthy of their respect rather than trying to prove they weren't. "Your education is quite impressive," Margaret said, settling into her favorite chair with her martini. "Wharton MBA. I understand. That's where Rebecca went as well, though I believe she was a few years ahead of you." "Actually, we would have overlapped," Rebecca Martinez replied. "I graduated in 2015. Though it's a large program, I'm not surprised we didn't meet." I watched David's face as he tried to do the math, his forehead creasing slightly as he realized the timeline didn't quite work. But before he could pursue the thought, Margaret was already moving on to the next topic, asking about Rebecca Martinez's family background and previous business experiences. "My parents immigrated from Mexico when I was 3, I heard myself explain. They worked incredibly hard to give me opportunities they never had. My father was a mechanic, my mother cleaned houses. They saved every penny to put me through school." It was my real story, told in my real voice, but they were hearing it for the first time. When I told David these same details during our courtship, he'd listened with polite interest before changing the subject. When Margaret had asked about my background during our engagement, she'd made subtle comments about how colorful my family history was. But now, coming from Rebecca Martinez, the story of immigrant parents working to give their daughter a better life was inspiring rather than embarrassing. "How admirable," Charles said. "That kind of work ethic and determination is exactly what built American business." "Absolutely," Margaret agreed. "It's so important to remember our roots and honor the sacrifices that made our success possible." I wanted to laugh at the hypocrisy, but I kept my expression neutral. These were the same people who'd spent 4 years making me feel ashamed of my background, and now they were praising those exact same experiences because they were coming from someone they saw as an equal rather than a charity case their son had married. The conversation flowed seamlessly from business philosophy to market trends to family traditions, with Rebecca Martinez participating as a valued equal while Rebecca Hawthorne served drinks and arranged appetizers like the hired help. I was simultaneously invisible and the center of attention, dismissed and respected, overlooked and carefully evaluated. As we moved toward dinner, Charles suggested we tour the company facilities the following morning so Rebecca Martinez could get a first-hand look at the operations she was considering purchasing. David offered to provide a complete financial overview, including profit and loss statements, client contracts, and growth projections. Margaret proposed introducing her to their social circle, the network of influential families who could provide both business opportunities and personal validation. They were rolling out the red carpet for the woman they'd never bothered to get to know when she was sleeping in their son's bed every night. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, around a table that could seat 16 but felt intimate with just the 5 of us. Margaret had outdone herself with a presentation: bone china that had belonged to Charles's grandmother, crystal stemware that caught the light from the chandelier, silverware that had been polished to mirror brightness. The turkey was perfect, the sides were elegant, and the wine was older than I was. Charles raised his glass for the traditional Hawthorne Thanksgiving toast, the same speech he'd given every year since I'd joined the family. But this year, there was an additional element of ceremony, a sense of occasion that went beyond simple gratitude. "To family," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of tradition. "To the legacy we've built and the future we're creating. And to new partnerships that honor our past while embracing tomorrow's possibilities." Everyone raised their glasses, including me. I was toasting my own success while playing the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law, celebrating the destruction of everything the Hawthorns thought they controlled while appearing to support their happiness. The conversation during dinner was everything I'd hoped for and more. Charles shared stories about the company's history that I'd never heard before, revealing vulnerabilities and challenges that would be invaluable during the final negotiations. Margaret discussed her concerns about preserving the family's reputation and social standing, unwittingly giving me a roadmap to her deepest fears. David talked openly about his anxieties regarding leadership and his desire to prove himself worthy of his inheritance. They were telling Rebecca Martinez everything I'd needed to know to buy their company, while keeping it all secret from Rebecca Hawthorne, who'd been living with them for years. But the most remarkable part was how differently they treated me when they thought I was someone else. Rebecca Martinez's opinions were asked for and carefully considered. Her expertise was respected and valued. Her presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. For the first time since my wedding day, I was experiencing what it felt like to be treated as an equal member of this family. It was intoxicating and heartbreaking at the same time. As we finished the main course and Margaret prepared to serve dessert, Charles leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just made the deal of his life. "Rebecca, I have to say, this evening has exceeded all of our expectations. You clearly understand what we're trying to accomplish, and I believe Distinct Holdings could be the perfect partner for Hawthorne Industries." "I'm so glad you feel that way," I replied. "I've been impressed with everything I've seen and heard tonight. Your family has built something truly remarkable." David was practically glowing with pride and relief. His parents approved of the buyer, the financial terms were attractive, and he'd be able to take on a leadership role without carrying the full weight of family expectations. It was everything he'd wanted but had been too afraid to ask for. Margaret returned from the kitchen carrying her famous bourbon pecan pie, the dessert that had been the grand finale of every Hawthorne Thanksgiving for as long as anyone could remember. She served each of us with the same careful attention to presentation that she brought to every aspect of her role as family matriarch. "Before we have dessert," Charles said, setting down his fork and looking around the table with ceremonial gravity, "I think this is the perfect time to make our announcement." My heart started pounding. This was it, the moment I'd been planning for over a year, the culmination of every insult, every dismissal, every time they'd made me feel like I wasn't good enough to be part of their world. David straightened in his chair, sensing the significance of whatever his father was about to say. Margaret clasped her hands together, her diamond wedding ring catching the chandelier light. I kept my expression politely interested while my pulse thundered in my ears. Charles stood up, raising his wine glass once again, his face serious but satisfied. "Family, friends, I'm proud to announce that we have reached an agreement in principle to sell Hawthorne Industries to Distinct Holdings for $30 million. The words hung in the air like crystal about to shatter. Rebecca Martinez has convinced us that her company shares our values and will preserve everything we've worked to build while taking the business to new heights we never could have reached alone." Margaret was beaming, David was grinning, and Charles looked like he'd just solved every problem his family had ever faced. "And the best part," Charles continued, his voice rising with triumph, "is that Rebecca Hawthorne will finally get the secure future she deserves, without having to worry about the complexities of running a family business." That's when I realized they'd never planned to include me in the sale at all. They'd been planning to sell the company and keep all the proceeds within the original Hawthorne bloodline, leaving me with nothing despite 4 years of marriage and all the legal rights I should have had as David's wife. They'd been planning to betray me even more completely than I'd understood. But I wasn't Rebecca Hawthorne anymore. I was Rebecca Martinez, and I was about to teach them exactly what betrayal looked like when it came from someone who actually knew how to fight back. The silence that followed Charles's announcement stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats. 3 heartbeats where I felt every emotion I'd suppressed for 4 years crystallize into perfect, diamond-hard clarity. They weren't just selling the company I'd been shut out of, they were selling it and planning to keep me shut out of the proceeds too. In that moment, I understood that this had never been about preserving family legacy or finding the right partner. This had been about finding a way to cash out while maintaining control, to secure their financial future while ensuring I remained exactly where they'd always wanted me, powerless, dependent, and grateful for whatever scraps they chose to throw my way. But Rebecca Martinez wasn't powerless. Rebecca Martinez was the woman holding all the cards they didn't even know were in play. I took a sip of my wine, set the glass down with steady hands, and smiled the kind of smile that had closed dozens of business deals over the past 2 years. "Charles, that's wonderful news," I said in my most professional voice. "I'm thrilled that we've been able to reach an agreement. Though I do have to ask, have you discussed the terms with your legal team? These family business sales can be complicated when it comes to spousal property rights and asset division." The question was perfectly innocent, exactly what a responsible buyer would ask to ensure there wouldn't be any legal complications down the road. But I could see David shift uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly remembering that his wife might have some legal claim to the business he was selling. "Oh, that won't be an issue," Margaret said quickly, with the kind of bright confidence people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as others. "Rebecca understands that this is a family legacy matter. She's always been very supportive of our business decisions." "Of course," I replied smoothly. "I just want to make sure we handle everything properly. In my experience, these transitions go most smoothly when all stakeholders feel heard and valued throughout the process." Charles nodded approvingly. "Naturally. Though I think you'll find that Rebecca is quite content with her role in the family. She's never shown much interest in the business side of things." Never shown much interest. For years of trying to contribute, of offering my expertise, of asking to be included, and they'd rewritten history to convince themselves I'd never wanted to be part of their world. "That's interesting," Rebecca Martinez said thoughtfully. "In my research on family-owned businesses, I found that spouses often have valuable insights precisely because they see the company from an outside perspective. Has Rebecca ever shared any thoughts about potential improvements or growth opportunities?" David laughed, actually laughed, as if the idea of his wife having valuable business insights was genuinely amusing. "Rebecca's more of a social person. She's great at organizing parties and charity events, but the technical aspects of manufacturing are probably over her head." Over my head. The woman who'd spent 2 years learning everything there was to know about their industry, who'd built a multi-million-dollar acquisition fund, who'd outmaneuvered their entire family without them suspecting a thing, was apparently too simple to understand their business. "I see," Rebecca Martinez said, making a note on her phone as if documenting potential legal complications. "And Rebecca is fully supportive of the sale? She doesn't have any concerns about the family business leaving Hawthorne control?" "She's thrilled for us," Margaret said firmly. "Aren't you, dear?" All 3 of them turned to look at me, really look at me, for the first time all evening, waiting for me to confirm that I was delighted to be excluded from the biggest financial decision my family had ever made, thrilled to watch them sell everything for $30 million that they had no intention of sharing with me. This was my moment. This was when I could let Rebecca Hawthorne speak her truth, when I could tell them exactly how their dismissal had felt, how their condescension had hurt, how their assumption that I was too stupid to contribute had shaped every day of our marriage. Instead, I smiled the same placid smile I'd been wearing to their family dinners for 4 years. "I just want what's best for the family," I said softly. "Whatever makes David and his parents happy makes me happy too." It was exactly what they expected to hear, exactly what they'd trained me to say. The perfect response from the perfect wife who knew her place and never questioned her betters. Rebecca Martinez nodded politely, though I could see something calculating in her eyes, something that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by the family harmony on display. "Well then," Charles said, raising his glass again, "I think this calls for another toast. To new partnerships and bright futures." We all drank, but the wine tasted like ashes in my mouth. Not because I was sad, but because I was about to destroy everything they thought they'd accomplished. After dessert, we moved to the library for coffee and brandy, settling into the leather chairs where 3 generations of Hawthorne men had made the decisions that shaped their family's destiny. Charles opened a bottle of cognac that was older than David, pouring it into crystal snifters that had belonged to his grandfather. "Now then," he said, settling back in his chair with obvious satisfaction, "let's discuss the timeline. I'm thinking we could have the paperwork finalized by Christmas, with the official transfer of ownership taking place in the new year." "That sounds reasonable," Rebecca Martinez agreed. "Though I should mention that Distinct Holdings will need to conduct a thorough due diligence process before we can finalize the terms. Financial audits, legal reviews, operational assessments, the standard procedures for an acquisition of this magnitude." David nodded eagerly. "Of course. We have nothing to hide. Our books are completely transparent, our client relationships are solid, and our operations are running smoothly." "I'm glad to hear that. One question, though. I notice you mentioned a purchase price of $30 million. How did you arrive at that valuation?" Charles smiled, clearly pleased to demonstrate his business acumen. "We based it on our annual revenue, growth projections, and asset valuations. $30 million represents fair market value for a company with our reputation and potential." Rebecca Martinez pulled out her phone, opening what appeared to be a financial calculator. "I'm showing some different numbers in my preliminary analysis. Based on your industry sector, client base, and current market conditions, I'm seeing a valuation closer to $28 million. Still substantial, of course, but I want to make sure we're working with realistic expectations." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Charles's smile faltered slightly, and I could see him recalculating his plans for how he'd spend the extra $2 million he'd been counting on. "Well, naturally the final price would be subject to negotiation," he said carefully. "But we feel our company's reputation and client loyalty justify a premium valuation." "Absolutely. And I'm confident we can find a number that works for everyone. Though I should mention that Distinct Holdings typically structures these acquisitions as earn-out agreements rather than lump sum payments." Margaret leaned forward, her perfectly composed expression showing the first crack of concern. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means the purchase price is paid over several years, based on the company's continued performance under new ownership. It protects both parties. We ensure we're buying a business that performs as promised, and you ensure you're getting full value for what you've built." David was frowning now, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of waiting years to receive the full proceeds from the sale. "How long are we talking about?" "Typically 5 to 7 years, with annual payments based on revenue targets and operational benchmarks." The room fell silent as the Hawthorne family absorbed this information. They'd been planning to receive $30 million in cash, money they could immediately use to secure their retirement, invest in new ventures, or simply enjoy as the reward for decades of hard work. Instead, they were looking at a much smaller immediate payment followed by years of uncertainty about whether they'd ever receive the full amount. "That's not exactly what we were hoping for," Charles said slowly. Rebecca Martinez nodded sympathetically. "I understand it's not ideal, but it's standard practice in the industry. Family business acquisitions can be tricky, emotions run high, expectations don't always match reality, and both sides need protection against unforeseen complications." She paused, taking a sip of her brandy, letting the implications sink in. "Of course, there are other buyers who might offer different terms. If you'd prefer a lump sum payment, you could always explore other options. Though I should mention that most of our competitors would probably offer a lower overall valuation in exchange for immediate payment." It was a masterful negotiation tactic, sympathetic understanding combined with subtle pressure, presenting herself as the best available option while making it clear that walking away would cost them money. Charles was doing rapid mental calculations, trying to figure out whether a smaller immediate payment might be better than a larger amount spread over years. Margaret was staring into her brandy snifter like it might contain answers to problems she hadn't expected to face. David was looking back and forth between his parents, waiting for them to tell him what to think. None of them were looking at me. None of them were wondering what the wife at the table thought about these financial decisions that would affect her future too. That's when I decided it was time to drop the first bomb. "Rebecca," I said, addressing my alter ego directly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what made you interested in acquiring companies like Hawthorne Industries? It seems like such a specific niche." Rebecca Martinez smiled, the expression warm but somehow predatory. "That's a great question. I've always been fascinated by family businesses, especially ones where the second or third generation is trying to honor their ancestors' legacy while adapting to modern market conditions." She set down her brandy snifter and leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "But I'll be honest, there's also a personal element for me. I've seen too many situations where family members, especially women, get excluded from business decisions that affect their lives. I like to think that when Distinct Holdings acquires a company, we're not just preserving a business legacy, we're ensuring that everyone who contributed to that success gets recognized and compensated fairly." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been noticed yet. Charles shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's grip tightened on her glass. David glanced at me with something that might have been the first flicker of genuine concern he'd shown all evening. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said quietly. "I imagine those situations can be quite painful for the family members who feel overlooked." "Devastating," Rebecca Martinez agreed. "Especially when they've been part of the business for years, contributing in ways that might not be obvious on a balance sheet but are crucial to the company's success." She paused, letting her eyes move slowly around the room, taking in the portraits of Hawthorne patriarchs, the absence of any women in positions of business leadership, the carefully maintained fiction that this was a family enterprise when it had always been a male-only enterprise. "But that's one of the advantages of working with Distinct Holdings. We believe that fair compensation and recognition aren't just morally right, they're good business practices that lead to smoother transitions and better long-term outcomes." Charles cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Naturally, we want to ensure that everyone is treated fairly. Though I should mention that Rebecca has always been well provided for. She certainly doesn't need to worry about her financial security." Well provided for. Like a pet or a child, rather than a legal partner in a marriage with legitimate property rights. Rebecca Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. Though I have to ask, Rebecca, how do you feel about the sale? This is obviously a major change for your family." For the second time that evening, all eyes turned to me. But this time, the question came from someone who was treating me like an adult capable of having her own opinions about decisions that would affect her life. This was it. This was the moment I'd been building toward for over a year. The moment when I could reveal who I really was and watch their world collapse around them. Instead, I took a breath and gave them one last chance to do the right thing. "To be completely honest," I said slowly, "I've always felt like I could contribute more to the family business than I've been allowed to. I have an MBA, years of consulting experience, and I really understand this industry. But I've never been included in any of the strategic discussions or decision-making processes." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles and Margaret exchanged glances. David stared at his hands. Nobody said anything for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending patience that had shaped so many of our interactions over the years. "Oh, sweetheart, that's very sweet. But business can be so complicated, and you have so many other wonderful talents. Why would you want to stress yourself with all those technical details when you're already so good at the things that really matter?" There it was. 4 years of marriage, and when directly asked about including me in the most important financial decision our family had ever made, their response was to pat me on the head and tell me not to worry my pretty little brain about things I couldn't understand. I looked around the room one more time. At Charles, who'd never bothered to learn what I'd studied in school or what I'd accomplished before I married his son. At Margaret, who'd spent 4 years making sure I knew my place in her family hierarchy. At David, who'd married me but had never actually tried to know me. They'd had their chance. They'd had 4 years of chances. Now it was Rebecca Martinez's turn to speak. "Well," she said, setting down her brandy snifter with deliberate precision. "That's interesting. Because based on what I've observed tonight, I think Rebecca might be underestimating her own capabilities." She stood up, walked to the window, and turned back to face the three of them with an expression I'd never been allowed to wear in this house. "In fact, I think this entire family might be underestimating Rebecca." And that's when I decided to detonate the bomb that would destroy everything they thought they knew about their perfect little world. Rebecca Martinez walked back to her chair, but instead of sitting down, she remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back in the posture of someone about to deliver a presentation that would change everything. "Before we finalize any agreements," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, sharper, more authoritative, completely in control, "I think there are a few things you should know about Distinct Holdings and how we operate." Charles straightened in his chair, sensing a shift in the dynamic but not yet understanding what was happening. Margaret set down her brandy snifter with careful precision. David looked confused, glancing between our guest and his parents as if waiting for someone to explain why the mood in the room had suddenly changed. I remained perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs as I prepared to watch 4 years of careful planning reach its inevitable conclusion. "You see," Rebecca Martinez continued, beginning to pace slowly around the room, "Distinct Holdings specializes in acquiring family businesses where the existing ownership structure doesn't accurately reflect the contributions of all stakeholders. We're particularly interested in companies where women, minorities, or other marginalized family members have been systematically excluded from decision-making processes despite their legitimate claims to participation." She paused in front of the portrait of Charles's grandfather, studying the stern-faced man who'd built the original Hawthorne Industries. "We've found that these exclusions often create vulnerabilities that make acquisitions more straightforward than they might otherwise be. Legal vulnerabilities, emotional vulnerabilities, strategic vulnerabilities that can be leveraged during negotiations." Margaret's face had gone pale. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Rebecca Martinez turned to face her directly. "I'm suggesting that your family business might not be quite as secure as you believe it is. Community property laws in Connecticut are quite clear about spousal rights in marital assets. If Rebecca wanted to challenge the sale of Hawthorne Industries, she would have very strong legal grounds to do so." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Charles was staring at our guest with the expression of a man who'd just realized he was in a poker game where he didn't know the rules. David had gone completely still, his face cycling through confusion, concern, and the beginning of what might have been understanding. "But that's ridiculous," Margaret said, her voice climbing toward the edge of panic. "Rebecca would never. She wouldn't. She's not." "She's not what?" Rebecca Martinez asked with deadly quiet. "Not smart enough to understand her legal rights? Not ambitious enough to want fair compensation for 4 years of supporting this family? Not strong enough to fight for what she deserves?" The silence that followed was the kind that comes just before thunder, when the air pressure changes and every living thing knows something catastrophic is about to happen. That's when I stood up. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and clear, "Rebecca is smart enough, ambitious enough, and strong enough to do exactly what needs to be done." I walked to where Rebecca Martinez was standing and turned to face my husband's family, letting them see my face clearly for the first time all evening. "Hello, Charles. Margaret. David. I don't think we've been properly introduced." David's face went completely white. Margaret made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. Charles gripped the arms of his leather chair so hard his knuckles went bone-white. "My name is Rebecca Martinez," I continued, my voice growing stronger with every word. "I'm the managing partner of Distinct Holdings. I have an MBA from Wharton, 8 years of consulting experience, and I've spent the past 2 years building a private equity firm that specializes in acquiring undervalued family businesses." I paused, letting them process the impossibility of what they were hearing. "I'm also Rebecca Hawthorne, the daughter-in-law you've dismissed as too simple to understand your business, the wife you've excluded from every important decision, the woman you've spent 4 years treating like an expensive pet you'd grown tired of but couldn't get rid of." David tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like he was drowning in air. That's impossible. You can't be, you don't, how? How did I build a multi-million-dollar acquisition fund while you thought I was organizing charity luncheons? I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. How did I learn everything there is to know about your industry while you assumed I was too stupid to contribute? How did I create a corporate identity sophisticated enough to pass your attorney's background checks while you believed I spent my days shopping and getting manicures? I walked to Charles's desk, picked up the Distinct Holdings business card I'd given him when I arrived, and held it up. Rebecca Martinez, managing partner. That's my maiden name, Charles. The one Margaret always made me feel ashamed of. The one that represents the family you thought wasn't good enough for your son. Margaret was shaking her head back and forth, like she could make reality disappear through sheer denial. This isn't possible. You're not. You couldn't have. We researched the company. We verified your credentials. You verified Rebecca Martinez's credentials, I corrected. And they're all real. Harvard MBA, summa cum laude. 8 years at McKinsey & Company, where I was on track for partner before I left to marry your son. 2 years building Distinct Holdings into a $32 million acquisition fund with backing from some of the most sophisticated investors in Manhattan. I set the business card down on the coffee table between us. Every degree, every job, every achievement you found when you researched Rebecca Martinez belongs to me. The only difference is that when I was Rebecca Hawthorne, none of you bothered to ask about my education, my experience, or my capabilities. You decided who I was based on my last name, my family background, and your assumptions about what kind of person your son would marry. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You've been planning this. All this time, you've been planning to buy your company. I finished. Yes, Charles. For over a year. Every family dinner where you discussed business in front of me like I was furniture. Every time Margaret explained that I wasn't smart enough to understand your industry. Every time David dismissed my suggestions without even listening to them. You gave me all the information I needed to plan the perfect acquisition. David was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, which in a way, he hadn't. Rebecca, I don't understand. Why would you do this? We're married. We're supposed to be a team. The question was so innocent, so completely lacking in self-awareness, that I almost felt sorry for him. A team, David? When was the last time you asked for my opinion about anything important? When was the last time you defended me when your parents made me feel unwelcome in our own marriage? When was the last time you treated me like a partner instead of a beautiful accessory to your life? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to think of a single example. I tried for 4 years to be part of this family. I offered my expertise, I asked to contribute, I suggested ways to help the business grow. And every single time, I was told that I wouldn't understand, that it wasn't my place, that I should focus on things more appropriate to my limitations. I looked around the room, at the 3 people who'd shaped my world for the past 4 years, seeing them clearly for the first time without the filter of trying to please them or earn their acceptance. So I built my own place. I created my own identity, my own success, my own power. And now I'm using all of that to show you exactly what you threw away when you decided I wasn't worth including in your world. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. What do you want? It was the first time in 4 years that any of them had asked me what I wanted. I want Hawthorne Industries, I said simply. I want the company you never thought I was smart enough to understand. I want the business you were planning to sell without giving me any say in the decision. I want everything you built while excluding me from it. Charles was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. You can't just. There are legal procedures, board approvals, fiduciary responsibilities. Actually, I can, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the email I'd been waiting 2 years to send. David, as my husband, you've been signing tax returns and legal documents that list Hawthorne Industries as a marital asset for the past 4 years. Under Connecticut community property law, I have a legal claim to 50% of the company's value. I hit send on the email, which went directly to my attorney, initiating the legal action I'd prepared months ago. I could challenge any sale in court and tie up your assets for years. Or... I paused, letting the alternative sink in. You can sell to me, at a fair market price, with terms that are actually favorable to you. David was staring at his phone, which had just buzzed with a notification. Probably from his attorney, who was about to call him with very bad news about his family's legal position. This is blackmail, Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. No, I corrected calmly. This is business. This is me using every skill you said I didn't have to outmaneuver a family that never bothered to learn who I really was. I walked back to my chair and sat down, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap like we were having a perfectly normal conversation. The offer stands at $30 million, paid over 5 years as originally discussed. That's actually above market value, and significantly more than you'd get if this turns into a legal battle. You get to retain management positions if you want them, the company name stays the same, and your employees keep their jobs. Charles was gripping his brandy snifter like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. And if we refuse? I shrugged. Then I file for divorce and claim my 50% community property share of Hawthorne Industries. We go to court, I present evidence of systematic exclusion and financial abuse, and a judge decides how to divide assets that are legally half mine already. That process could take years, during which time the company can't be sold to anyone else. The silence stretched for almost a full minute before David finally spoke. How long? He asked quietly. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I realized you married someone you had no interest in knowing, I replied. Since I understood that your family saw me as an expensive mistake they had to tolerate. Since I accepted that the only way to get respect from any of you was to take it. Margaret was crying now, silent tears that she was trying to hide behind her brandy snifter. Charles looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. David was staring at me like I was a stranger, which, I supposed, I was. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, I said, looking directly at David. If Rebecca Martinez had been the woman you'd met at that charity gala 5 years ago, would you have fallen in love with her? He considered the question for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, realization, and something that might have been shame. Yes, he finally admitted. I think I would have. Then maybe, I said softly, you should ask yourself why you never tried to find out if Rebecca Hawthorne was the same person. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of shock or denial, but the silence of people finally understanding how completely they'd misjudged everything they thought they knew. That's when Charles surprised me. 30 million, he said slowly. 5-year payout. Management positions retained. Company name unchanged. I nodded. Those are the terms. He looked at his wife, then at his son, then back at me. And what happens to us? To the family? It was the first time he'd ever asked me what I wanted for our relationship, rather than telling me what my role should be. That, I said, depends on whether you're capable of treating Rebecca Martinez with the same respect you've shown her tonight. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the door. Think about it, I said, turning back to face them one last time. You have until Monday to decide whether you'd rather do business with someone who knows exactly what this company is worth, or fight a legal battle against someone who knows exactly what this family cost her. As I reached the doorway, David called my name. Rebecca. I turned. I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time in years, he sounded like he meant it. I know, I replied. But sorry doesn't change the fact that you never asked who I really was. It just means you're finally ready to find out. And with that, I walked out of the Hawthorne family home, leaving behind 4 years of being underestimated and stepping into a future where I would never be overlooked again. The drive home took exactly 17 minutes, but it felt like crossing between 2 different worlds. I sat in my car in our driveway for another 10 minutes, watching the lights in our house flicker on and off as David moved through the rooms, probably trying to process what had just happened. Our house. Except it had never really felt like ours, had it? Like everything else in our marriage, it had been his house that I'd been allowed to live in, his decisions that I'd been expected to support, his family's approval that I'd spent 4 years trying to earn. My phone had been buzzing constantly during the drive. Text messages from David, missed calls from Charles, even a voicemail from Margaret that I wasn't ready to listen to yet. But I turned off the phone and sat in the silence, trying to absorb what I'd just accomplished. I had done it. After 18 months of planning, 6 months of preparation, and 4 years of being treated like an expensive decoration, I had finally shown the Hawthorne family exactly who they'd been dismissing. The look on their faces when they realized that Rebecca Martinez and Rebecca Hawthorne were the same person would stay with me for the rest of my life. But underneath the satisfaction was something I hadn't expected: grief. Not for the marriage, that had been dead for longer than I'd wanted to admit, but for the person I'd been before tonight. Rebecca Hawthorne had officially ceased to exist in that library, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. When I finally walked into the house, David was sitting at our kitchen island with a glass of whiskey and a stack of legal documents spread in front of him. He looked up when I entered, and I could see that he'd been crying. "I called our attorney," he said quietly, "about the community property issue." I set my purse on the counter and poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle we'd opened for dinner. Dinner that felt like it had happened in another lifetime, though it had been less than 6 hours ago. "And what did he tell you?" "That you're right. About everything. If we'd sold to another buyer without your consent, you could have challenged it. You do have a legitimate claim to 50% of the company's value." He took a sip of his whiskey, his hands shaking slightly. "He also said that the legal structure you set up for Distinct Holdings is impressive. Sophisticated. The kind of thing that takes years of experience to execute properly." I sat down across from him, studying the man I'd been married to for 4 years but had apparently never really known, just as he'd never really known me. "David, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "When did you stop seeing me as a person?" The question hung in the air between us. He stared into his whiskey glass for a long time before answering. "I don't think I ever stopped seeing you as a person," he said finally. "I think I don't know. I got comfortable. You were so good at fitting into our world, at making everyone happy, at being what we needed you to be. It was easier to let you do that than to ask what you needed from us." What I needed was to be included. To be treated like an equal partner in our marriage, not a beautiful accessory to your life. "I know that now." He looked up at me, and I could see genuine remorse in his eyes. "But I didn't know it then. I thought you were happy. I thought the life we'd built was what you wanted." "Did you ever ask me what I wanted?" Another long pause. "No. I don't think I ever did." We sat in silence for several minutes, two people who'd shared a bed for 4 years finally having the most honest conversation of our marriage. "So what happens now?" he asked eventually. "Now you and your parents decide whether you want to sell me the company, or whether you want to spend the next 2 years in court fighting about community property division." "And us? What happens to our marriage?" I took a sip of my wine, considering the question I'd been avoiding all evening. "I don't know, David. I honestly don't know if there's anything left to save." "Do you want there to be?" For the first time since I'd walked out of his parents' house, I felt tears threatening. Not tears of anger or frustration, but tears of genuine sadness for everything we'd lost, everything we'd never had, everything we might have been if we'd both tried harder to actually know each other. "I want there to be," I said finally. "But I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I can trust any of them again." David nodded slowly. "I understand. I think I'm finally starting to understand a lot of things I should have understood years ago." My phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from James Chen at Meridian Capital, congratulating me on what he called the most elegant acquisition strategy I've ever witnessed. The private equity world moved fast, and word was already spreading about what had happened at the Hawthorne family Thanksgiving. "How many people know?" David asked, seeing me check the message. "About tonight?" "Just the people who were in that room." "But about distinct holdings? About my real background and capabilities?" I shrugged. "That's going to be much harder to keep quiet. By Monday morning, everyone in our social circle is going to know that the wife they dismissed as a pretty decoration actually built a multi-million-dollar private equity firm while they thought she was planning charity luncheons." David winced. "Mom's going to have a hard time with that." "Your mother's opinion of me stopped mattering the day she told me I wasn't smart enough to understand your family's business. She didn't mean it the way it sounded." I set down my wine glass and looked at him directly. "David, yes, she did. She meant it exactly the way it sounded. Just like you meant it when you laughed at the idea that I might have valuable business insights. Just like your father meant it when he said I'd never shown interest in the company. He had the grace to look ashamed. You tried to show interest. You asked questions, made suggestions. We didn't listen." "No, you didn't. Because listening would have required accepting that I was more than you thought I was, and that would have complicated the simple story you'd all created about who I was supposed to be in your family." The next few hours passed in a blur of difficult conversations, legal consultations, and family phone calls that I could hear through the walls of our house. Charles called David 3 times. Margaret called twice. David's younger sister called from California, apparently having heard something about Thanksgiving dinner drama through the family network. Each conversation forced David to explain, again and again, that his wife had been leading a double life for 2 years, building a private equity firm capable of acquiring his family's company while they all assumed she was too simple to understand their business. Around midnight, David came to find me in our home office, where I was reviewing the legal documents that would formalize the Hawthorne Industries acquisition if his family decided to accept my offer. "My parents want to meet with you," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Just the 4 of us. To negotiate. To apologize, I think. And to try to understand how we got here." I leaned back in my chair, studying my husband's face in the dim light from my desk lamp. "And what do you want, David?" "I want to understand too. I want to know who you really are, not who I thought you were. And I want to know if there's any way we can rebuild something from this mess I helped create." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll meet with them. But this isn't a negotiation about the business deal. The terms are what they are. This is about whether we can find a way to be a family that actually includes all of its members." "I understand. And David? If your parents spend that meeting trying to convince me to give up my legal rights or accept less than I'm owed, I'm walking away from all of it. The business deal, our marriage, everything. I won't spend another day of my life being diminished by people who think my value is negotiable." He nodded, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine respect in his eyes when he looked at me. "I'll make sure they understand." The next morning, I woke up before dawn and spent an hour getting ready for what felt like the most important meeting of my life. Not because of the business deal, that was already decided, but because it would determine whether the Hawthorne family was capable of change, or whether I'd have to walk away from 4 years of marriage to preserve what was left of my self-respect. I chose my outfit carefully, a navy blue suit that was professional but not intimidating, paired with jewelry that was elegant but not ostentatious. I wanted to look like Rebecca Martinez, competent, successful, worthy of respect, while also looking like Rebecca Hawthorne, the daughter-in-law they'd never bothered to see clearly. Charles and Margaret were waiting in their formal living room when David and I arrived, both of them looking like they'd aged years overnight. Margaret's usual perfect composure was cracked, her makeup unable to hide the evidence that she'd been crying. Charles looked smaller somehow, diminished by the realization that his family's carefully controlled world had been completely upended by someone he'd never taken seriously. "Rebecca," Margaret said as I entered the room. She started to stand, then seemed to think better of it, settling back into her chair with uncertain grace. "Thank you for coming." It was the first time she'd ever thanked me for anything. I sat down across from them, with David taking the chair next to mine in what felt like a symbolic choice between his parents and his wife. For the first time in our marriage, he was sitting with me rather than between us. "I think we owe you an explanation," Charles began, but I held up a hand to stop him. "No," I said quietly. "You owe me an apology. There's a difference." The words hung in the air for several seconds before Margaret spoke. "You're right. We do owe you an apology. Several apologies." Her voice was shaky but determined. "I'm sorry for making you feel unwelcome in our family. I'm sorry for dismissing your intelligence and your capabilities. And I'm sorry for spending 4 years trying to make you smaller instead of celebrating what you brought to our family. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. More honest than anything she'd ever said to me before." Charles cleared his throat. "I'm sorry too. For treating you like a guest in your own marriage. For making assumptions about your abilities based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had. And for making business decisions that affected your life without including you in the process." David took my hand. "And I'm sorry for not protecting you from all of this. For not standing up for you when I should have. For marrying someone I never bothered to actually know." I felt tears threatening, but they weren't tears of anger anymore. They were tears of grief for all the time we'd wasted, all the opportunities we'd missed, all the ways we'd failed each other without even realizing it. "The question now," I said carefully, "is what we do with these apologies. Whether they're just words, or whether they represent a genuine commitment to change." Margaret leaned forward. "What would you need from us? To believe that we're committed to change?" It was the first time any of them had ever asked me what I needed. "I need to know that Rebecca Martinez and Rebecca Hawthorne are the same person in your minds. That you respect my intelligence, my capabilities, and my right to be included in decisions that affect my life. And I need to know that when you look at me, you see a daughter-in-law, not a charity case your son married." "You have that," Charles said immediately. "After what you've accomplished, how could we see you as anything else?" "Because it shouldn't have taken me buying your company to earn your respect," I replied. "It should have been enough that I was your son's wife, that I loved him, that I wanted to be part of your family." The room fell silent as they absorbed the truth of that statement. "You're right," David said quietly. "And I don't know how to fix the fact that we failed you so completely. You fix it by doing better going forward. By treating me like the partner I should have been all along. By including me in the family I've been part of for 4 years but never really belonged to." Margaret was crying openly now. "Can you forgive us? Can you give us another chance to be the family you deserved from the beginning?" I looked around the room at 3 people who'd hurt me deeply, who diminished me systematically, who'd made me feel like I had to choose between being myself and being loved. But I also saw 3 people who were finally, genuinely sorry for what they'd done. 3 people who were asking for my forgiveness instead of demanding my compliance. 3 people who were ready to treat me like an equal instead of a subordinate. "I'm willing to try," I said finally. "But this isn't just about forgiveness. This is about rebuilding everything from the ground up, based on honesty and mutual respect instead of assumptions and traditions." "What does that look like practically?" Charles asked. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared the night before. "It looks like me taking an active role in Hawthorne Industries, not just as the owner but as a strategic partner. It looks like family decisions being made by the whole family, including me. And it looks like all of us learning to communicate honestly instead of hiding behind politeness and expectations." I handed them each a copy of the organizational chart I'd created for the company's new structure. Rebecca Martinez, Chief Executive Officer. David Hawthorne, Chief Operating Officer. Charles Hawthorne, Chairman of the Board. Margaret Hawthorne, Director of Community Relations. David looked up from the document. "You want us all to work together. I want us all to be honest about what we're good at and how we can contribute. Your father has 40 years of industry experience and relationships. Your mother has incredible organizational skills and social connections. You understand the day-to-day operations better than anyone. And I have the strategic vision and financial expertise to take the company to the next level. I paused, looking at each of them in turn. But only if we can function as a team. Only if we can respect each other's contributions and communicate honestly about challenges and opportunities. And only if we can build the kind of family business that actually includes all family members as equals. Charles studied the organizational chart for several minutes before looking up at me with something approaching admiration. This could work, he said slowly. This could actually work. It will work, I corrected. Because I won't accept anything less than success. I've spent too many years accepting less than I deserve. Margaret reached across the space between us and took my hand. We want to be better. We want to deserve the second chance you're offering us. For the first time in 4 years, when Margaret Hawthorne touched me, it felt like genuine affection rather than performed politeness. Then let's be better, I said. All of us. As we spent the rest of the morning working through the details of our new family dynamic, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't want to destroy them anymore. I wanted to transform us, all of us, into something we'd never been before. A real family. An equal partnership. A business built on mutual respect rather than inherited privilege. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time since I'd married into the Hawthorne family, I believed it might actually be possible. If you're still with me at this point, if you've been following this entire journey from betrayal to revenge to something that might actually be redemption, go ahead and hit that like button. Because what I'm about to tell you next is how this story really ends, not with destruction, but with something I never expected to find. Hope. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything, I was sitting in what used to be Charles's private office at Hawthorne Industries, reviewing quarterly reports that showed a 37% increase in revenue since the acquisition. The office still had his grandfather's portrait on the wall, but now it shared space with my Harvard MBA diploma and a photograph of my parents at my business school graduation, the first time anyone from my family had ever been displayed in this building. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been heated arguments, uncomfortable conversations, and moments when I'd wondered if we were all just pretending to change while secretly hoping things would go back to the way they'd always been. But slowly, painfully, honestly, we'd built something new from the wreckage of what we'd been before. David knocked on my door, something he'd learned to do instead of just walking into spaces he assumed belonged to him. "Got a minute?" he asked. "I wanted to run the Chicago facility proposal by you before the board meeting." 6 months ago, David would have presented his ideas to his father and assumed I'd go along with whatever they decided. Now he came to me first, recognizing that as CEO, I needed to approve major operational changes before they went to the board. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What are you thinking?" He spread out architectural drawings and financial projections, explaining his plan to modernize the facility his great-grandfather had opened in 1962. It was a good plan, financially sound, operationally efficient, and respectful of the facility's historical significance. But more importantly, it was his plan, developed through his own analysis rather than inherited assumptions about what the company should be. "I love it," I said when he finished his presentation. "But I think we should consider expanding the scope. If we're going to invest in modernization, we might as well position ourselves to take on larger contracts. What if we increase the budget by 20% and design the facility to handle the kind of government contracts we've been turning down?" 6 months ago, David would have dismissed the suggestion as too risky, too ambitious, too different from how his family had always done business. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started taking notes. "That's brilliant," he said. "I hadn't thought about scaling up for government work, but you're right, we've been leaving money on the table by limiting ourselves to private sector clients. Your father has relationships with defense contractors from his Navy days," I added. "Maybe we should ask him to reach out to some of his old contacts." It was a small moment, but it represented something revolutionary in the Hawthorne family dynamic. A business conversation where everyone's expertise was valued, where good ideas were welcomed regardless of who suggested them, where we built on each other's strengths instead of competing for dominance. The board meeting that afternoon included all 4 family members for the first time in the company's history. Charles sat at the head of the table, But instead of running the meeting like a patriarch delivering pronouncements, he facilitated discussion like a chairman whose job was to ensure everyone's voice was heard. "The quarterly numbers are strong," he began, "but I think the real story is how we achieved them. Rebecca's strategic planning, David's operational improvements, and Margaret's community outreach have all contributed to our best performance in over a decade." Margaret smiled at the acknowledgement. Over the past 6 months, she transformed her role from disapproving mother-in-law to strategic asset, using her social connections to open doors we'd never had access to before. Her charity work had always been impressive, but now we were leveraging those relationships to build business partnerships that benefited everyone. The Riverside Hospital project came directly from contacts I made through the Children's Cancer Charity, she reported proudly. They need specialized equipment manufacturing, and our reputation in the non-profit community gave us credibility with their board. It was the first time I'd ever seen Margaret take genuine pride in contributing to the family business rather than just protecting it from change. "Outstanding," I said. "That kind of diversification is exactly what we need to reduce our dependence on traditional manufacturing contracts." Charles nodded approvingly. "And David's proposal for the Chicago expansion positions us perfectly for that diversification." The meeting continued for 2 hours, covering everything from financial projections to staffing plans to marketing strategy. What made it remarkable wasn't the business we discussed, but how we discussed it, as equals, as partners, as people who respected each other's expertise and contributions. After the meeting, David and I drove home together, another small change that represented something significant. For 4 years, we'd lived parallel lives in the same house, rarely talking about anything more meaningful than weekend plans or social obligations. Now we spent our commute debriefing about work, sharing ideas, and actually listening to each other's perspectives. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," David said as we turned into our driveway. "About positioning ourselves for government contracts. I think you're right, but I'm worried about the timeline. Those relationships take years to develop." "Maybe," I agreed. "But maybe not. Your father's reputation carries weight, and our performance over the past 6 months proves we can deliver. Sometimes timing is everything." We were still talking about the proposal when we walked into the house, continuing a business conversation that had started at work but didn't end just because we'd crossed the threshold into our personal life. It was something we'd never done before, bringing our professional partnership home and letting it strengthen our personal relationship instead of competing with it. That evening, Margaret called to invite us for Sunday dinner, something that had become a weekly tradition since Thanksgiving. But now, instead of elaborate performances of family harmony, these dinners were opportunities for honest conversation about both business and personal matters. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said when David handed me the phone. "I've been thinking about the community relations position you created for me." "What about it?" "I love the work, and I think I'm good at it. But I've never had a real job before, never earned my own paycheck, never been valued for my professional contributions rather than my social connections." There was vulnerability in her voice that I'd never heard before, the sound of someone discovering capabilities she'd never been allowed to explore. "I'd like to take some business courses," she continued. "Maybe get certified in non-profit management or corporate communications. I want to be worthy of the role you've given me." It was a complete reversal from the woman who'd spent 4 years telling me that business was too complicated for my pretty little head to understand. "Margaret, that's wonderful," I said. "I think that's exactly the kind of professional development we should be supporting for all family members. Would you be willing to help me choose the right programs? You understand this world so much better than I do." She was asking for my advice. Margaret Hawthorne, the woman who'd once told me that certain topics were best left to people with more experience, was asking for my professional guidance. "I'd be honored to help," I said, and I meant it. Sunday dinner was a revelation, as these family gatherings had become over the past few months. Charles talked about his Navy experiences and how they might translate to government contracting relationships. Margaret shared ideas for expanding our community outreach programs. David presented refined versions of his Chicago facility plans. And I discussed the strategic vision I'd developed for the company's 5-year growth trajectory. But what made the evening special wasn't the business discussion. It was a personal conversation that happened alongside it. Charles asked about my parents and genuinely listened when I talked about their immigrant experience. Margaret shared stories about her own mother's struggles as a woman in the 1950s business world. David talked about his fears of not living up to family expectations and how liberating it had been to finally work as part of a team instead of carrying everything alone. We were becoming a real family for the first time, built on mutual respect and honest communication rather than inherited roles and unexamined assumptions. As David and I drove home that night, he reached over and took my hand, something he'd started doing again over the past few months, except now it felt different. Like affection between equals rather than possession of property. "I need to tell you something," he said as we pulled into our driveway. My heart tightened. Despite all the progress we'd made, there was still a part of me that expected him to say he couldn't handle being married to someone stronger than he'd thought, someone more successful than he'd been prepared for, someone who'd outmaneuvered his entire family. "I'm proud of you," he said instead. "Not just professionally, though what you've accomplished is incredible. I'm proud of who you are, how you've handled everything, how you've given us all a chance to be better than we were." He paused, staring at our house, the house that finally felt like it belonged to both of us. "I'm also proud of us. Of what we're building together. I know it's not the same marriage we had before, but I think it's better. I think we're better." I squeezed his hand, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, hope for our future together. "We are better," I agreed. "All of us." That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, really next to him, not just sharing space but sharing dreams and plans and honest conversation, I realized that revenge had transformed into something I'd never expected. Redemption. Not just for me, but for all of us. The Hawthorne family that had dismissed me, excluded me, and underestimated me no longer existed. In its place was something new. A partnership built on mutual respect, a business built on everyone's strengths, and a family built on love that included rather than conditionally accepted. I'd set out to destroy everything they'd built without me. Instead, I'd ended up transforming all of us into something we'd never been before, a real team, working together toward goals we'd set together, respecting contributions that came from everyone rather than just the people who'd always held power. It wasn't the revenge I'd planned, but it was the justice I'd needed. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, when I thought about the future, I didn't see a golden cage or a performance I had to maintain. I saw possibility. 1 year later, I stood in the conference room of Hawthorne Industries, looking out at an audience of business leaders, industry experts, and journalists who'd come to hear about what they were calling the Hawthorne transformation. The company had just been named Manufacturing Business of the Year by the Connecticut Business Association, and I'd been invited to speak about our journey from traditional family business to modern corporate partnership. But as I looked out at the crowd, I wasn't thinking about business metrics or industry recognition. I was thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment, from dismissed daughter-in-law to CEO, from excluded outsider to respected leader, from someone fighting for scraps of acknowledgement to someone commanding a room full of successful people who wanted to learn from my experience. 18 months ago, I began. I was a wife and daughter-in-law who felt invisible in her own family's business. Today, I'm the CEO of a company that has tripled its revenue, expanded into new markets, and created a workplace culture based on inclusion, innovation, and mutual respect. The audience was listening intently, but I could see David, Charles, and Margaret in the front row, and their expressions told the real story. Pride, yes, but also amazement at how far we'd all come from the people we'd been at that Thanksgiving dinner. The transformation of Hawthorne Industries wasn't just about changing business strategies or implementing new technologies, I continued. It was about recognizing that every family member, regardless of gender, background, or traditional role, brings valuable perspectives and capabilities that can strengthen the organization. I clicked to the next slide, which showed our financial performance over the past year. The numbers were impressive: revenue growth, profit margins, client satisfaction scores, employee retention rates, but what made me most proud was what the numbers represented, proof that including everyone's strengths made us stronger than any individual could be alone. When we started this process, we had to confront some uncomfortable truths about how power had been distributed in our family and our business. We had to acknowledge that talent, intelligence, and leadership ability aren't determined by who inherits what role, but by who's willing to work hard, think strategically, and put the organization's success above personal ego. Margaret was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Over the past year, she'd not only completed her certification in corporate communications, but had also launched a consulting practice helping other family businesses develop more inclusive leadership structures. She was scheduled to speak at 3 conferences over the next 2 months, sharing insights about how traditional families could evolve without losing their core values. The most important lesson we learned, I said, advancing to a slide that showed photographs of our team working together on various projects, is that respect isn't something you inherit or something that's given to you because of your position. Respect is something you earn through your actions, your contributions, and your commitment to lifting up everyone around you. Charles raised his hand from the audience, and I nodded for him to speak. Rebecca, can you talk about how this transformation affected your personal relationships? How do you balance being CEO with being a daughter-in-law and wife? It was a question we'd prepared for, but it was also deeply personal. The answer had to acknowledge how painful our journey had been while also celebrating what we'd built together. That's probably the most important question you could ask, I said. Because business transformations are really relationship transformations. When we changed how we worked together professionally, we had to change how we related to each other personally. I looked directly at David, remembering the conversation we'd had just that morning about whether we were ready to start thinking about having children who would grow up in a family where everyone's contributions were valued, where leadership was earned rather than inherited, where love was demonstrated through inclusion rather than protection. My husband and I had to learn how to be partners instead of playing traditional roles that didn't fit who we actually were. My in-laws had to learn how to be parents and grandparents to someone they'd never bothered to really know. And I had to learn how to be part of a family while also being myself, all of myself, not just the parts that were convenient for other people. A woman in the audience raised her hand. What would you say to other women who feel overlooked or undervalued in their family businesses? I thought for a moment before answering, remembering the woman I'd been 2 years ago, angry, hurt, planning revenge because I couldn't imagine any other way to claim the respect I deserved. I'd say that your worth isn't determined by whether other people recognize it. Your capabilities aren't diminished by other people's inability to see them. And your right to be treated as an equal isn't negotiable, regardless of how much easier it might be for everyone else if you accepted less. I paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected my own journey, some people nodding in recognition, others looking skeptical, a few taking notes furiously. But I'd also say that revenge isn't the only response to being underestimated. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is create such undeniable success that the people who dismissed you have no choice but to confront their own assumptions. Sometimes the best revenge is building something so remarkable that everyone benefits from your capabilities being fully recognized. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from financial restructuring to family governance to strategic planning. But the real story wasn't in the business metrics, it was in the relationship transformation that had made everything else possible. After the event, our family gathered at the same restaurant where David and I had eaten dinner on our first date 7 years earlier. It was Margaret's suggestion, her way of acknowledging how far we'd all traveled from the people we'd been when this journey started. I keep thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner, Charles said as we waited for our appetizers. How completely wrong we were about everything we thought we knew. You weren't wrong about everything, I said generously. You were right about wanting to preserve the family legacy and build something sustainable. You just didn't understand that the best way to do that was to include everyone's strengths instead of limiting yourselves to traditional approaches. David reached for my hand across the table. I still can't believe I was married to someone for 4 years without really knowing who she was. You knew who I was, I corrected. You just didn't know what I was capable of. There's a difference. Margaret smiled. We all learned what we were capable of, didn't we? I never imagined I'd be running my own consulting practice at 65, helping other families figure out what took us so long to understand ourselves. It was true. The transformation hadn't just changed my position in the family. It had revealed potential in all of us that we'd never explored before. Charles had discovered that his real gift wasn't running operations but building relationships and opening doors. David had learned that he was actually a brilliant operational strategist when he wasn't trying to live up to someone else's vision of leadership. Margaret had found her voice as a business professional after decades of believing her only value was social. And I had learned that the revenge I'd planned wasn't what I'd actually needed. What I'd needed was respect, inclusion, and the chance to contribute everything I was capable of contributing. Once I had those things, the anger that had driven my elaborate scheme transformed into gratitude for a second chance to build something beautiful from what had once been broken. So what's next? Charles asked as we finished dinner. What's the 5-year plan for this family? It was exactly the kind of question he'd asked hundreds of times over the years, but now it included everyone at the table. Now it assumed that we'd be making decisions together rather than accepting pronouncements from the family patriarch. I think, I said slowly, that we keep growing. The business, yes, but also our capacity to support each other, to challenge each other, to build something together that's stronger than anything any of us could create alone. David squeezed my hand. I think we're ready to start thinking about the next generation too. About what kind of family we want to be for our children. It was the first time he'd mentioned children in public, and I could see Margaret's eyes light up at the possibility of grandchildren who would grow up in a family where everyone's potential was nurtured rather than constrained by traditional roles. Children who know from the beginning that their worth isn't determined by their gender or their position in the family tree, I said. Children who learn that leadership is about serving others, not commanding them. Children who understand that the strongest families are the ones where everyone's voice matters. Charles raised his wine glass. To the next generation, then. And to the lessons we've learned about what it means to be a real family. We all raised our glasses, but before anyone could drink, Margaret spoke up. Wait, she said. I want to add something to that toast. She looked directly at me, and I could see tears in her eyes. To Rebecca, who loved us enough to fight for what we could become, even when we couldn't see it ourselves. Who showed us that the strongest families aren't the ones that never change, but the ones that have the courage to grow together. I felt tears threatening, but they were tears of joy rather than the anger and frustration that had driven me for so many years. And to all of us, I added, for proving that it's never too late to become the people we were meant to be. We clinked glasses around the table, for people who'd started as strangers playing family roles and had become something real, something chosen, something built on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. As we walked out of the restaurant that night, David put his arm around my shoulders, and I realized that for the first time in 7 years, the gesture felt completely natural. Not possessive, not performative, just affectionate connection between two people who'd finally learned how to be partners. I love you, he said as we reached the car. Not the woman I thought I married, and not the woman you had to become to get my attention. I love you, all of you, exactly as you are. It was the first time he'd ever said those words and meant them about the real me. I love you too, I replied. And I love who we're becoming together. 6 months later, I found out I was pregnant with our first child. When I told David the news, the first thing he said was, "She's going to grow up knowing she can be anything she wants to be." "How do you know it's a girl?" I asked, laughing. "I don't," he said. "But I hope she is. I hope she's exactly like her mother, brilliant, strong, and completely unwilling to let anyone make her smaller than she was meant to be." Margaret cried when we told her she was going to be a grandmother. Not tears of joy, although she was thrilled, but tears of gratitude that her grandchild would grow up in a family where love was demonstrated through inclusion rather than protection, where strength was celebrated rather than contained. Charles immediately started planning a college fund and talking about all the leadership skills he wanted to teach his grandchild, regardless of gender. This baby is going to grow up understanding business, understanding family, and understanding that their contributions matter from day one, he declared. As I write this, our daughter Emma is 3 years old, and she's already showing signs of the determination and intelligence that run in both sides of her family. But more importantly, she's growing up in a world where her voice matters, where her ideas are valued, where her potential is nurtured rather than constrained by anyone else's expectations. She calls me Mama and she calls David Daddy, but she also calls Charles Grandpa CEO and Margaret Grandma Boss, because that's how she understands our family structure. Everyone has important work to do, everyone contributes their strengths, and everyone's role is valued equally. When people ask me about the Hawthorne Industries story, about how a family business transformation became a case study taught at Harvard Business School, I always come back to the same lesson. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but redemption creates lasting change. I could have destroyed David's family out of anger and hurt. Instead, I transformed all of us into something we'd never been before, a real partnership, a genuine family, a business built on everyone's strengths rather than inherited privilege. The woman who planned to buy her husband's company as revenge no longer exists. She's been replaced by someone who built a family business that includes everyone, respects everyone, and succeeds because of everyone's contributions. And that transformation, from revenge to redemption, from exclusion to inclusion, from tradition to innovation, has been the most satisfying victory of my life. Not because I won, but because we all did. To everyone who's watched this entire story, who's followed this journey from betrayal through planning to revelation and finally to transformation, thank you. Thank you for staying with me through every twist, every emotion, every moment of this incredible journey. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or excluded from decisions that affect your life, I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. Your capabilities aren't diminished by other people's blindness. And your right to respect, inclusion, and equal partnership isn't negotiable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so beautiful, so successful, so undeniably valuable that everyone benefits from recognizing your true worth. Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, because everyone deserves to know that they're capable of more than the people around them might realize. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of proving what you're really capable of. And remember, the strongest families, the most successful businesses, and the most meaningful relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, and the radical idea that everyone's contributions matter. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for believing that transformation is possible, even when it feels impossible. And thank you for reminding me that the best stories aren't about getting revenge on the people who hurt us, they're about building something so remarkable that everyone, including the people who once dismissed us, becomes better because we refuse to accept less than we deserved. This is Rebecca Martinez Hawthorne, CEO of Hawthorne Industries, wife, mother, daughter-in-law, and living proof that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is transform revenge into redemption. Until next time, remember your worth, claim your space, and never let anyone convince you that you're smaller than you know yourself to be.